if there was somebody you didn't like and you kind of wanted to get rid of them, you accused them of being a communist. And the accusation was frequently strong enough to actually destroy people's reputations. And people's reputations were destroyed. And this was kind of a very vicious period in American in American history. And I think that all kinds of places went up. For instance, Hollywood would suspect there was this whole kind of attack upon Hollywood and the communist influence in Hollywood. And a lot of people were put on a blacklist. And so if you were on the blacklist, you couldn't participate and so on. Academics. In some state universities, you had to take a loyalty oath in order to teach in that university. And if you refused to take a loyalty oath on grounds of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and all this kind of thing, you lost your job. So a lot of academics lost their jobs, and a lot of things got pushed in this anti-communist movement, and it had huge implications. And the implications were largely that the whole ideology, if you like, of thinking in the United States shifted ground, and it shifted to a ground where it felt that it could be neutral in relationship to a lot of political questions. In other words, people started to say, well, we want a social science, just social sciences for a moment. We want a social science which is truly scientific and objective. And to be scientific and objective meant that you had to actually go out and get the data and you started to mathematize everything. Economics was not really a mathematical science in 1945, but by the time you get into the 1970s, it's become mathematized. And it's become mathematized in a sense, because who can argue with the math? If you got the math on your side, and you did the investigation and it was objective, and therefore the social sciences became sciences, and there was a whole scientific model set up, which allowed you to do research without appearing to be political. So that you couldn't be political in your academic discipline. So the whole university structure is organized around trying to create a neutral situation in which objective science could carry the day. And one of the things that I get nervous about, where people these days kind of saying, "Oh, just listen to the science, do the science, we follow the science." Well, this was the sort of thing that people did back in the 1950s and 1960s, was to try to scientize everything so that it was respectable. And by that form of respectability, there were certain things you could say and certain things you could not say. Now, I was raised as a geographer, and I would go to geography meetings. Now, geography historically has been the handmaid of empire and colonialism and militarism and all the rest of it. You could not go to a meeting and say that. You could not. If you wanted to say something political, you did it because the data told you. So you would get great data sets which would show there's social inequality or something of that kind, and say something has to be done politically or remedially on this. So in effect, the whole university and structure, and the knowledge structure, and the, if you like, the sort of ideological zeitgeist of the time was very much around that you couldn't talk politics directly. You could make your political point if you could mathematize it. So if you could show a mathematical model which showed that there was a model that would show that there's great deal of social inequalities increasing or something of that kind, or there's great differentials in healthcare and something like that, then if you had the scientific model, then you could present it. But you couldn't say, we live in a class society. And a class society is about inequality. We live in a racist society. We couldn't say that. Or we couldn't use the word imperialism. And there was the United States engaging in an imperialist war, and you couldn't talk imperialism. There you were in a world where racism was rampant, and you couldn't talk race. You couldn't talk any of these things. So by the time you get to the 1960s, you start to get this free speech movement. It's a revolt against the ideological constraints that have been set up in that period of the 1950s and 1960s, which led all of the social sciences, for example, to become mathematical, scientific, and all the rest of it. Now, the thing about that is, of course, also that you can only say certain things with science. and mathematics. In order for there to be mathematics, you have to be able to measure something, and all kinds of things need to be measured, and you don't know how to measure them. How do you measure, for example, political power? Do you have quanta of political power? No, they are all, in fact, the key elements of our thinking are all immaterial but objective. Immaterial in the sense that you can't actually put your finger on them and write, but at the same time, they have objective consequences. So take a question of political power, for example. It's an immaterial concept, but it has objective consequences. You see what it does. And by virtue of its objective consequences, you can start to sort of look back and say, what is this political power doing? Where does it come from? What is it all about? And all the rest of it. So the ideological structure, and this was supported in lots of ways, of course, by the rise of television and Hollywood and all the rest of it, which was incorporated, if you like, into this kind of ideological configuration in which there were certain things you could say and certain things you couldn't say. Now, there was a very interesting theory that Herbert Marcuse, amongst others, was promoting during the 1960s, which is what he called repressive tolerance. And it says this: we want to show we're a tolerant society, we're an open society. And so we let all kinds of things go, which help us and say, okay, yeah, we are open, we're good. But it's repressive in the sense that there are always walls that you cannot go the other side of. There are always ceilings you cannot go through. In other words, there's a box-like structure. And as soon as you go over one of those boundaries, you're in trouble. You're in deep, deep trouble. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I went through. And, when I was 35, I started reading Marx, and I started reading, and I started to say, well, there's some interesting things here. They help us explain things better than some of that scientific economics and scientific sociology and scientific political science that's out there. Marx has something to say which is relevant. And I'll just sort of simply say that. Well, I only had to say it 4 or 5 times, and I'm called a Marxist. And I couldn't get published. But this is what's meant by repressive tolerance. It's kind of really, really interesting. So I was getting my articles rejected because I sort of talked about Marx. I was called a Marxist. I didn't know what a Marxist was. And I said, well, okay, if they're going to call me a Marxist, I suppose I'm a Marxist. But I never kind of said, look, I'm a Marxist. This was something that was, it's the wall. And it's the anti-communist wall. It's the anti-communist, it's the anti-Marxist that's there. And this situation became extremely tense through the free speech movement in Berkeley, and you get the 1960s movements and the student movement and all the rest of it. You kind of look at the kind of science they're supposed to study in the university and say, what's this got to do with the Vietnam War? What has this got to do with what's going on in terms of the racial uprisings and so on that are going on in the American cities at the time? We're obviously hiding something, and so there came all this pressure upon the universities, for example, to open up and to allow for certain things to be discussed, which had not hitherto been discussed. And this is what the free speech movement was about. And it crested, of course, around the late 1960s. But it was a direct response, if you like, to the repression which had been orchestrated in the McCarthy period and in the House of Un-American Activities Committee period. It's a direct product of that. So it's in that sense that I say one of the contradictions which existed in 1945 was the fact that the United States was in alliance with communism and had an experience of centralized planning and all the rest of it. And at the same time, there was a good deal more union power and worker power because of the employment situation during the Second World War. And there's a lot of recognition that you cannot go back to the kind of free trade, free market model of the 1920s. You just can't go back to that. So conventional people were kind of saying we have to examine a future of a mixed economy in which the government and the private sector are going along parallel tracks, and in some respects the government is actually calling the shots.